Hey guys, it's Katie, and I'm here today to do a review of Circe by Madeline Miller. So the way I'm going to do this video is the first part is going to be spoiler-free, just in general what it's about, and my typical usual kind of breakdown that I normally do. But then the other half of this is going to be a bit more of a discussion kind of a thing, and there will be some spoilers. So if you haven't read the book and you haven't read the myths or aren't familiar with a lot of Greek mythology, you're going to want to probably come back once you've either read the myths or read the book, and kind of so you can have a better understanding and also just sort of don't spoil you. So getting into generally what this book is about, the book mostly follows Circe's life. It's kind of a biographical telling of her life, and it was so phenomenally done. And that's kind of just the gist of what it's all about. Breaking it down into my normal analyses of the writing, plot, world building, and the characters. So first, the plot. The plot is, in some ways, its weakest link because of the way it's told. It is a very, very slow book, but in my honest opinion, I didn't find it too terribly slow, but I do know some people that had a really big issue with that. I would warn you that if you don't really love slow books, in a lot of ways, this might not be for you. But also, if you haven't read a lot of Greek mythology before, you might get a little lost at certain points. I don't want to say that to deter you, but there are a lot of name drops throughout the book. Some of them are quite obscure, but if you've read, for instance, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, you're probably going to be better off than if you haven't read either of those. Or you could just do a little bit of research as you're going if that won't deter your enjoyment. But that's just definitely something to be aware of. And that, because that might also kind of hinder the plot and things. But if you're totally fine with that, then you might be a little bit fine with the plot as well. The writing was stunning. It was so beautifully written. It was gorgeous. Things just kind of fell off the page. It was like wrapping yourself in a warm blanket or walking on the beach and having the waves lap at your feet. Like, it was just so welcoming, and it's just absolutely stunning. Because I actually was reading another book alongside it, and just the writing styles and the way the authors wrote, like the one book I'm like liking, okay, but the writing is just not my favorite thing in the world. And then I would jump over to Circe and I just find all of the tension leaving my body. Like, it was just so calming, even though things in the story might not have been the most calming thing. It's fine. And then the world building is just ancient Greece, and it's just following ancient Greece over kind of centuries, because Circe is immortal, so time means nothing to her, and it was kind of written in a similar way. So that also adds to the kind of like the slow pacing plot things that I was kind of mentioning. But I mean, so the world building is just kind of did itself in a way, but Madeline Miller did it in such a way that made it come to life and made it simplistic but also easy to follow. It's hard to explain because, as I said, there are a lot of name drops and events and things that if you haven't read a lot of the things, you might not understand the full experience, but it's still enjoyable nonetheless. The characters. I mean, everything is told from Circe's point of view, so she is our main character. And she was so well written and such an interesting and fascinating character to follow. I loved seeing her journey from, just throughout her whole life, how she got from one place to another, and how one event led to another and caused her to kind of become the way that she did ultimately. It was just a really gorgeous journey. I know some people had an issue with it, but when I get to the spoilery section, I'm going to touch on it a little bit more. Um, so yeah, just bear with me. And I apologize if you're one of my non-spoilery people. It's hard to explain otherwise. Characters that we got to see were really interesting. We saw them all through Circe's eyes. So, I mean, for instance, her interactions, particularly with her family members and certain men that were in her life at certain points or another. I just really loved the dynamics between each of those characters because while some of them were short-lived, it felt so fleshed out and just so in depth, even though it only might have lasted a chapter or two or a paragraph or two. It's just, she is a phenomenal writer and she did such a great job with her characterization and just making everything come alive. So, definitely one of her strong points is the world building and then her characterization. It just was just everything that I wanted and more. And it was even more interesting reading it after Percy Jackson because, you know, as I might have mentioned before, it kind of refreshed my mind on a lot of characters and just kind of who they all were because there are so many different gods, goddesses, minor gods, and titans, and everybody to just keep track of. So many different heroes, and it just, I love that reminder so that now when I was reading kind of intermediate version of kind of Rick Riordan and those myths, it was just so much more interesting and exciting. And now I'm like severely tempted to go back and reread the Iliad and the Odyssey and all of the other myths. So I definitely recommend picking them up. However, there are some trigger warnings for sexual assault, rape, and some abuse, whether it's verbal or physical. There's a lot of potential trigger warnings to keep an eye out for. So now I'm going to launch into my discussion. So if you are non-spoiler people, I apologize. And I'll talk to you guys later when you've read the myths or the actual book. So, bye guys. Friends, so I'm going to touch on some of the things that some other people have had issues with and talk a little bit about some spoilery things. So, one of the big issues that some people have is how Circe's journey was portrayed. It was just kind of like people think that, you know, the big turning point for Circe turning evil was when she got raped. And I'm going to disagree with that because if you read the book carefully from the very, very beginning all the way up to kind of that point, I would say the rape and the sexual assault was actually the tipping point for Circe's transformation, if you will, because she was verbally abused, neglected, and just emotionally manipulated by her entire family. Her father hated her. Her mother hated her. Her siblings thought she was weird and just didn't like her. She was an outcast in her own family, whether it was with other titans or other gods or her own family, like in immediate family. She was just shunned and set aside, and the only person that she was kind of somewhat close to was her brother. And even that was a bit of a tense relationship, especially since he kind of upped and left when she was young and she hardly saw him and stuff. So I mean, arguably that transformation kind of started early, but then when she was cast into exile by Zeus, I mean, being that young and being sent to an island to live by yourself because of something that is out of your control, because she's a witch, she was using elemental magic and doing all kinds of really cool, phenomenal things with it. The gods were afraid of that, and so they just decided to put her on an island by herself to kind of keep an eye on her. I mean, think about that for a second. Your own family ratting you out for something that you did, and then your punishment is to be put on an island by yourself. I mean, that is the utmost betrayal. But then also, just her whole relationship with Glaukos, just, she fell in love with him. He fell in love with her when he was a human, and then she transformed him into a god. But he didn't. And then once he was in his quote godly form, he never even spared her a glance, and he just kind of cast her aside and was like, "Yeah, I only felt for you like a sister." And he was, courting other people and things, and she was just so utterly heartbroken. And I mean, I've been there, still there sometimes. And so, I mean, that kind of hurt. On top of the familial shunning and emotional manipulation and just constantly trying to be good enough for her family members, that adding to her heartbreak over Glaukos and just all of that, I mean, that is really damaging to someone. And then ultimately going into exile and dealing with all of these men, and ultimately she gets raped. And that, I think, was the tip of the iceberg for her, because just every tiny little thing was going wrong. She wasn't good enough for anyone. She was just treated like garbage. Someone violated her to that extent that they did in that scene. And the fact that she, froze up. She was thinking about all the things that she could do, but she froze up. I know people who've been sexually assaulted, harassed, raped, and I fall into the sexual harassment / sexual assault category myself. I've been in a situation like that before, and it's one of the biggest things that I mean, for me, was shock. Like, oh my God, what is happening to me? And you're just freeze. And the same thing happened to Circe. She was like, oh my God, what the hell? But then at the same time, she was like, I can do all of these things to them. And then, but she didn't do any of it until after it happened. And that was just, I said, the full tipping point. Is all this buildup, and then that final violation just put her over the edge. And she went on a rampage against men for a long time. Even when Odysseus came, she turned all of his crew members into pigs too. She didn't do it to him, but it was just difficult to see. And a lot of people, I know a couple of other people have had issues with the fact that there really was no aftermath and that it wasn't dealt with healthily. And I will agree on that. But at the same time, I think what she did instead, what Madeline Miller did instead, was have her kind of going on this vendetta against men and turning them into pigs, like pretty much every single time she got a sailor bunch on her island. And that was her kind of her way of punishing men for the acts that they do, while also getting a catharsis herself and letting out her anger and her feelings about the whole, letting out her anger and her experience out on them, like her wrath out on them for that. And then finally, when Odysseus comes and he treats her with respect, they didn't start their relationship right away. It took some time. And I know people who had the issue with like the fact that they just kind of, there was no issue with her just jumping into bed with him. But the thing is she was wary of him. She wasn't sure what his motivations were a large portion of the time. And finally, when she kind of started to get to know him, she was finally kind of comfortable enough to do that. Moving on to another topic, because I feel like we've talked about this one enough. The issue of certain things, the issue of certain people thinking that certain things are not in the myth. Okay, first of all, there is a portrayal of bestiality in the book. And it's not shown, but we see the results of it, and that is Pasiphae basically had a relationship with a cow that produced the Minotaur. And it is true that in the myth, she was kind of enchanted into the way that she really didn't have a choice in the matter. And Madeline Miller just kind of changed it and to make it that she chose to do the thing because she just wanted to. And so, I mean, I guess that is just a weird interpretation of that specific myth. Same thing with Helios and his cows, because that was also a thing. I guess it's a family trait. Yeah, Greek gods are a hot mess. Okay, just if you don't know that by now, they're just mess. They're just a mess. Okay, great. Helios did have cow children, and I mean that was a thing. So I mean that was very much in the myths. The same thing with Circe ultimately marrying her stepson. And yeah, Circe marrying her stepson Telemachus. So there's a complicated situation in that Odysseus ends up having 2 kids with 2 different people. As we know from the, well, as we know from the Odyssey, he is married to Penelope. He loves Penelope. They have a child together, Telemachus. However, on his adventure journey thing, when he was with Circe, they ended up conceiving a child which he did not know about, and she just kind of bore that alone, and they had a child named Telegonus. And it becomes really complicated because at one point there's this whole, prophecy, because, prophecies are the life of Greeks in that period of time. Circe ends up going under the sea and talking to this other god named Trigon. And she basically gets his tail and turns it into a spear. Originally because she wanted to use it against gods, but she ends up giving it to him, to Telegonus, when he goes on his journey to Ithaca, because he wants to go visit his dad. Cool. Well, the spear ends up killing Odysseus, as you know. As always happens in Greek things, because Greek tragedy is real. And, but he actually ends up meeting Telemachus and Penelope, and they really take a liking to him. And so they end up coming to Aiaia with Telegonus, and they meet Circe. And basically, while they're all grieving over Odysseus' death, kind of a thing, they all kind of fall in love mess thing. So the way it works, and I know people are like, oh my god, incesty things, but if you haven't read Greek myths and Greek stories before, this is not the worst ever. If you want worse things, go read Oedipus. That is a hot mess, like even a bigger mess than this whole situation. But basically what happens is Telemachus ends up marrying Circe. They fall in love. But the weird part is Telemachus is Circe's stepson. Cool. But yeah, Penelope ends up just kind of chilling, and it's fine. She hones her own witchy powers, which I think is super cool. And Athena ends up recruiting Telegonus to kind of do her bidding, and he's all for that. So he goes and he does that life. But the thing that people fail to know is that actually did happen in the myth. I know people don't think it did, but it did. I don't remember if it happened in the Odyssey or if it was just kind of a separate story that was written at one point, but definitely happened, and it's definitely referenced across, I think, multiple different tales. Telemachus and Circe end up being a thing. I mean, the thing is Madeline Miller knows her myths, and she knows her ancient history. I mean, she has a master's from Brown. She is very, very qualified to write things like this. Doesn't mean you have to like them, but she has definitely done her research. She knows what she's doing. She knows what she's talking about. Usually in Greek myths, if there's a weird thing and you don't like it, it's real. Yeah. Another thing I'm not a huge fan of people doing is comparing the Song of Achilles and Circe. They are nothing alike. It's like comparing apples to oranges, and I hate that analogy, but it's like comparing apples to oranges. You literally cannot compare the two of them. They are written by the same author, and they both follow certain Greek myths. That is all of the similarity that there is, and that's all that people should look at. Like, they're very separate books, they're very separate stories, they're written very differently. And so for people to say, I liked one over the other because of X, Y, and Z, I'm not judging you for liking one over another, because that's fine. But the fact that people are comparing the two for A, B, and C reasons, they're not comparable. You can't do it, in my honest opinion, as a scholar of classics and mythology and history. You can't compare the two. They're very, very separate stories. I thought it was phenomenally done, stunningly done. As I said, Madeline Miller clearly knows her research. She knows what she's talking about. She's very qualified to write on these topics. So feel free to let me know down below whether you read Circe or any other Madeline Miller works, or if you're planning on reading any of them, or if you have any questions about anything. And then also, of course, I have both my social media links down below. I have a Twitter and a Goodreads. And I will catch you later with another video. Bye!